This is strand something, 1, continued, called Portrait Objects 1. And I am very honored to be introducing the speakers today, who include 2 of my very favorite people on earth, and a third one, Rachel Gottlieb, who my 2 favorite people really seem to like. So this is going to be a good session. We're going to start with Dr. Janice Helland, who is Professor of Art History at Queen's University, Canada, stolen from Concordia University. She has published articles in journals such as Textile History, Costume, Journal of Design History, Journal of Modern Craft, among others, and most recently co-edited Craft, Community, and the Material Culture of Place and Politics, 19th to 20th Century, Ashgate, 2014. She also published British and Irish Home Arts and Industries, 1880 to 1914, Marketing Craft, Making Fashion, the Irish Academic Press, 2007, and co-edited Craft, Space, and Interior Design, 1855 to 2005, Ashgate, again, 2008. Her research interests lie in the area of craft and design, particularly as they relate to the area of philanthropy and fair trade. It gives me enormous pleasure to then invite you to the podium for 20 minutes. I should have told myself that.
Thank you, Catherine. That's a hard act to follow. Okay, is the mic correct? Yes? My research on embroidery over the past few years has focused on 19th century dresses, embroidered under the auspices of philanthropic organizations such as the Donegal Industrial Fund, upon making and meaning, collaborative production, and so-called fair trade practice. So I want to thank, I think I'm thanking, Alicia Boudelier for inviting me to write the catalog entry on samplers for the artist herself, which propelled me into a whole new area of research on embroidery. And Lisa Bauer, Nova Scotia Museum, and Elaine Patterson, Concordia University, for their information, insights, and support. As the saying goes, errors and omissions are entirely my own. In 2007, Canadian textile historian Joyce Taylor Dawson wrote that samplers have always been among the most researched topics in the field of embroidered textile history because, maintained Dawson, they provide a wealth of information and they have enormous appeal for embroiderers, collectors, and historians alike. She then went on to observe that writings about samplers fall into 2 separate categories. 1, histories, descriptions of collections, catalogs from exhibitions, and 2, how-to books. My own cursory exploration of the field supports Dawson's observations, with the addendum that first, some how-to books often provide brief but insightful historical observations, and second, scholarship, rather than how-to, tends to focus on discrete bodies of work. For example, Jennifer Salahub's pioneering research on Quebec samplers, or Carol Humphrey's 1997 scholarship on samplers in the collection of the Fitzwilliam Museum at Cambridge University. Embroidered samplers have a long history, and although much English language scholarship focuses on an English tradition that immigrated to other geographical areas along with the makers or owners, they exist in many cultures. One of the earliest in the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum, for example, is Egyptian, dated 14th to 16th century linen embroidered with silk. The earliest in the Fitzwilliams collection, also Egyptian, from the 15th century. The earliest reference to samplers in European literature dates to the 16th century. My focus today will be upon 3 British and Canadian samplers, with a brief introduction to the sampler and scholarship on samplers, closing with a discussion about the selected samplers designed and made by girls between the ages of about 9 and 11 during the years 1824 to 1833. To begin, virtually all writing about samplers describes the origin of the term, from an Anglo-French dictionary of 1530, an exemplar for a woman to work by, or derived from the Latin exemplum, with a meaning that is self-explanatory, an example. Most literature also looks back to band samplers, which form the largest group of 17th century samplers. These are long and narrow, usually on linen, with horizontal bands of repeated motifs, and could be easily rolled. British samplers of this period included stitches in brightly colored silk. The greater range of silks, an indication of increased trade with India and the Far East after the establishment of the East India Company. The designs themselves, according to Humphrey, were undoubtedly based on those in early German and Italian printed books. By the early 19th century, the period I'm interested in today, similar patterns were still in circulation, but the form of the sampler had moved away from a long, narrow band to a broader, rectangular shape, like the one by Elizabeth Turner in the exhibition. Before looking closely at the Turner, I want to return to the Fitzwilliam Museum and look briefly at scholarship in the field. According to Dawson, social history and context has become increasingly important in recent years, and research tends to focus on samplers in collection with data, names, dates, and so on. Furthermore, wrote Dawson, exhibition catalogs can provide insight into the variety of samplers gathered together at one particular time and place. Both statements epitomize the Fitzwilliam collection, manifested first in Humphrey's 1997 publication, which takes the form of a catalogue or handbook, followed more recently by an online exhibition and research project inaugurated by Lena Rana in 2013. Humphrey's project provided a sophisticated introduction to samplers, along with a close examination of selected samplers from the Fitzwilliams collection. She highlighted 2 major bequests, one given in 1928 by a Trinity College mathematician and collector, who, according to Humphrey, was both wise and fortunate to be collecting at a time when samplers were not widely sought, and another given by Harriet Ann Longman of the Longman Publishing family in 1938. More recently, Lena Rana's online exhibition of 18th and 19th century samplers in the Fitzwilliam collection exemplified a social history and material culture approach to the object. As she states in her introduction to the exhibition, she, quote, was eager to discover information about the makers, the schools they attended, the function of needlework in these institutions. She relied upon local record offices and libraries, consulted archival materials such as minute books and registers related to a particular school, consulted online genealogical sites and local history societies, and even visited one of the schools. This coincides with the allegation that named and dated samplers often have locational, archival, iconographical, aesthetic, and transferal value, which greatly increases their appeal to historians and collectors alike. An article published in 2014 in the Journal of Modern Craft complements Rana's digital exhibition. Rana's online project and her article parallel other developments in the study of samplers, which can be seen in Dawson's 2007 research on the collection of samplers produced by the pupils of the Ursuline Convent School in Quebec from 1780 to 1900. The title of her published article is self-explanatory: Undated, Unattributable, and Unfinished, Forgotten Samplers and Their Reevaluation Through Archival Research. And like other recently published research, she examines one collection, as did Jennifer Van Horn in her article, Samplers, Gentility, and the Middling Sort, published in the Winterthur portfolio in 2005. Van Horn's meticulously researched article focused upon one Pennsylvania schoolmistress and 10 known samplers produced under her tutelage by the daughters of artisans, grocers, and barbers, who, argued Van Horn, created samplers not as an assertion of eliteness, but as a demonstration of the middling ranks incorporation of refined objects and activities into their sociable behaviors. Amy Newell, on the other hand, in a 2009 book chapter, deliberates upon one embroiderer in order to interrogate the changing roles of women in antebellum New England, and a short but highly informative catalog entry that accompanied a single sampler included in the Metropolitan Museum's 2014 exhibition, Interwoven Globe, the Worldwide Textile Trade, 1500 to 1800, demonstrates the complexity and distinctiveness to be found in some objects. In this case, according to the entry, 13-year-old Laura Hyde made the rather surprising choice to embroider a scene of a Turkish harem onto her needlework sampler. These publications, and others like them, support Dawson's postulation, quote, "From an academic perspective, the historiography of samplers in the past 25 years has moved from the descriptive to the analytical, and from a single discipline to a multidisciplinary approach." From this brief overview, I now would like to turn to my thoughts and speculations as I explore the production and consumption or collecting of samplers. Specifically, I should like to deliberate upon why samplers were and are collected, and discuss them as handcrafted objects that represent the self and the material culture of childhood. Why have samplers been collected, particularly by museums? The Victoria and Albert Museum in London, for example, has a collection of over 700 samplers. The National Museum of Wales holds over 400 samplers, including the Lewis sampler reproduced in the catalogue. The V&A's first acquisition was in 1863, and their range is extensive in country of origin and style, as well as date. According to a V&A publication, the collection reflects the museum's early and continuing recognition of the contribution made by samplers towards documenting the history of embroidery, its teaching and practice, and the widespread appeal to museum audiences. Scottish textile historian Liz Arthur attributed the interest in embroidery in general to the arts and crafts movement of the late 19th century. According to Arthur, an understanding of the best embroidery from the past was seen as a means of improving the standard of contemporary design and public taste. Whilst early samplers, such as this band sampler from the Fitzwilliam Museum, were stitched by women, many of the 19th century samplers and major collections were made by female children. For a moment, let's turn away from museums such as the V&A, the Fitzwilliam, the Metropolitan, the Museum of Wales, and look at a different kind of museum, museums of childhood, such as, for example, the National Trust Museum of Childhood in Sudbury Hall, Edinburgh's Museum of Childhood, which advertises itself as the first museum of childhood in the world, or the Museum of Childhood in Bethnal Green, operated by the V&A. The objects in these museums are made for children. Few are made by children. And clothes and toys are the most frequently occurring objects. This wrapping gown, for example, made of cotton in England, was probably influenced by Asian clothing given to families of those who had trade links with the region. are dolls, like this one dated about 1880, made in London. Again, few objects in the collections, if any, were made by children. And from the perspective of some material culture theorists, it might be argued that in these cases, agency resides in the object. The object itself may not dictate, but certainly guides its purpose. Or, if I decided to revisit post-structuralism, I could say that toys made for children perform the task of interpolation of children as subjects within the place assigned to them in the social order. One might argue that samplers perform similar tasks, whether from the perspective of material culture or from theories based on Althusser or Lacan, or following on from Rosika Parker's groundbreaking publication, The Subversive Stitch, 1984, which has informed almost all comments on samplers. That embroidery represented an inculcation of femininity. It taught obedience and patience, that femininity did not come naturally to little girls. It was difficult to instill, but because it was inculcated at a very early age, it appeared to be innate. However game-changing that research was, I want to move beyond these discussions with which we are very familiar and suggest instead alternatives. The making of samplers by young girls can give agency to the girls rather than only to the object, can attest to their skill, their ingenuity, and their ability to bring craft and design together in a memorable product, to innovate and make a statement about self. I should like to speculate upon, in keeping with the theme of the exhibition, the sampler as the product of a child's reflection upon herself and her world, a form of self-portrait. To do this, I'd like to turn to the research I did about the samplers in the exhibition for the catalogue. Samplers, such as the one made by Elizabeth Turner, were regularly used by embroiderers when hand stitching was a required practical skill. But by the 19th century, and while young women still relied on pattern books, a tendency toward more originality in design and unique combinations of stitches could be found on what remained a relatively standardized format. Linen or wool ground, silk thread, letters and numerals, text that was often religious or personal, and personal devices from everyday life, such as a house, flowers, trees, all made with a variety of stitches. Turner's sampler included letters and text, as well as designs common to many samplers. But the large hybrid bird, possibly a water bird, imaginably may reference her coastal home, and complements the ship, an unusual device, in the right-hand corner. Ships may have been included when they formed part of a child's identity. In Turner's case, her father commissioned a trading schooner in 1829, which he named the Elizabeth, perhaps after his daughter. The sampler is dated 1833. Mary Lewis also included ships in her sampler, and like Turner, this may reference her South Wales home, a coastal area noted for its ports. Thus, we are reminded of shared motifs and devices included by young women that, while close in date, are an ocean apart. It may also tell us that embroiderers highlighted the personal, or selected patterns that narrated the self, even when so obviously not trained in the same place. They may have had access to the same or similar pattern books, or the inclusion of the ship in both instances may suggest that makers conscientiously referenced their own environments. Jane Toller, in her publication British Samplers, 1980, contended that samplers vary in different parts of the British Isles. Welsh and Scottish samplers each have their own style. She alleged that reading Welsh samplers, such as Mary Lewis's, is as fascinating as reading a fairy tale. One never knows what motif or object will be portrayed. One thing seems certain: the child must have designed some part of the sampler herself and simply put into stitchery what she might have drawn on paper. Toller also asserted that only a child would place such very large squirrels on such very small trees. And she has had a free hand in the seascape pictured below. Like Lewis, Elizabeth Turner, too, introduced the fanciful, most prominent in the large bird, perhaps a seabird with baubles, and her oversized butterflies exude cheerfulness with their dappled wings. Another sampler, embroidered by 11-year-old Mary Ann Scrimes, perhaps made in England and brought to Kingston, or made in Kingston, reinforces the concept of individual choices. She rejected the use of the most frequently included early 19th century feature, a flat, box-like, often Georgian-style house visible on the Turner and Lewis samplers, selecting instead to highlight a large, centrally placed bouquet of flowers. She too, like Turner and Lewis, incorporated a framing device, a curving, typically floral border that tended to disappear after the early 19th century, but also, like them, she opted for personal choice as well as pattern. In these three instances, and likely in many other samplers by children, decisions about color, stitches, which devices to include, what to highlight, the text, all indicate the importance of personal choice and a degree of creativity effective to speak of the self. In these cases, the making of samplers by children, agency does not belong exclusively to the object, as with toys made for children, but resides as a form of reciprocity with the child in exchange with her environment. Thank you.